Elias Ward sat alone in the corner booth of Lou's Diner, staring at a half-eaten burger he no longer wanted. Outside, Boston glittered with Christmas lights strung across storefronts and lampposts, the kind of decorations that made everyone else smile. He hated them. Every blinking bulb felt like a reminder of what he'd lost, what he'd failed to hold on to. The diner was nearly empty at 11 on Christmas night, just a few stragglers like him who had nowhere else to be. He pulled out his phone and opened the last text from his daughter. Lila had sent it 3 days ago, a photo of her standing in front of a Christmas tree with her mother and stepfather, all of them wearing matching red sweaters. The tree was enormous, covered in gold ornaments and white lights. Lila's smile was wide and genuine, the kind she used to give him when she was younger, before the divorce, before the distance. Her stepfather stood with his hand on her shoulder the same way Elias used to do. The message read, "Going to the Bahamas for Christmas. Love you, Dad." He'd replied with a thumbs-up emoji because he didn't know what else to say. What could he say? That he wished she were with him. That would only make her feel guilty, and she didn't deserve that. Elias was an architect, successful by most standards. He'd spent 15 years designing office buildings and luxury condos across New England, projects that paid well and kept him busy. Too busy, his ex-wife used to say. Too busy to come home for dinner. Too busy to make it to Lila's school plays. Too busy to notice when his marriage was falling apart. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, and his ex-wife had moved to Connecticut shortly after. She'd remarried within a year, and Lila had taken to her stepfather quickly. Elias told himself it was good that she was happy. But it didn't stop the hollow feeling in his chest every time he thought about it. This Christmas, Lila was on a beach somewhere with her new family, and Elias had turned down invitations from co-workers who pitied him enough to include him in their holiday plans. He didn't want their pity. So he'd come here to Lou's Diner, a place where no one knew him and no one cared. The door chimed, and Elias glanced up. A woman walked in, and he recognized the uniform immediately. Boston Police Department. She looked young, late 20s maybe. A beautiful black woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun that had come loose in places. Her uniform was wrinkled and soaked through, streaked with salt stains from the snow and something darker that might have been mud or blood. One of the buttons on her shirt was missing, and her badge was slightly bent. She unbuttoned her coat slowly, like even that small movement required effort. She didn't look around the diner. She just moved to a booth across the aisle from him and slid in, then let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for hours. Her shoulders slumped forward, and she stared at the table like she was trying to disappear into it. Elias watched her without meaning to. There was something about the way she sat there completely still. She wasn't on a break. She wasn't waiting for someone. She was just there the same way he was. He recognized that posture. It was the posture of someone who had nothing left to give. The waitress, an older black woman with graying hair and a kind face, walked over with a pot of coffee. She smiled at the officer. "Tough shift, officer." The woman looked up and managed a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just another Christmas." The waitress nodded, poured the coffee, and walked away. The officer wrapped her hands around the cup and stared into it. Her hands were shaking slightly, and Elias could see bruises on her knuckles, scrapes across the back of her hand. Whatever she dealt with tonight hadn't been easy. Elias felt something twist in his chest. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough. It was the look of someone holding themselves together by sheer willpower. Someone who couldn't afford to fall apart because there wasn't anyone there to catch them. He thought about Lila again, about the last time they'd spent Christmas together. She'd been 7, still young enough to believe in Santa Claus and magic. They'd stayed up late decorating the tree, and she'd insisted on putting the star on top herself. Elias had lifted her up, and she'd placed it carefully, her face glowing with pride. Later, they'd made cookies together, and Lila had gotten flour everywhere. She'd laughed so hard she'd almost fallen over. Elias had thought he'd always have moments like that there would always be time. But time had run out faster than he'd expected. He thought about leaving, about going back to his empty apartment. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of Lila. Maybe it was the realization that he'd spent the last 3 years avoiding connection because he was afraid of failing again. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that he couldn't stand to watch someone else sit alone the way he had. Elias stood up, picked up his coffee, and walked over to her table. She looked up when he approached, her expression guarded but not hostile. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her jaw was set like she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. Her eyes were dark brown, and they held a weariness that told him she'd seen too much. Elias cleared his throat. "Excuse me. I know this might sound strange, but would you mind if I joined you? I just don't think anyone should be alone on Christmas." She stared at him for a moment, and he could see her assessing him. Cop instincts, probably checking if he was a threat. Her eyes scanned his face, then dropped to his hands. He stood there, feeling awkward, waiting for her to tell him to go away. Finally, she said, "Sure, why not?" Elias slid into the seat across from her and set his coffee down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The diner was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional scrape of a fork against a plate from one of the other tables. Outside, snow continued to fall. The officer took a sip of her coffee. "I'm Rhea." "Elias." She didn't offer a handshake, and he didn't push. They sat there in silence. Two strangers who had nothing in common, except the fact that they were both sitting in a diner on Christmas night, neither of them with anywhere else to be. And for the first time in a long time, Elias didn't feel completely alone. Rhea glanced at him. "So, what do you do, Elias?" He told her he was an architect, that he worked for a design firm downtown. She nodded like she was listening, but he could tell she wasn't really interested. It was just conversation. Elias added, "We just finished a project in the seaport. Luxury condos, the kind of place where people pay millions for a view of the harbor." Rhea looked at him with something that might have been curiosity. Must be nice, designing things that last. Elias shrugged. "I suppose. But most of the time, it just feels like pushing paper, making rich people richer." Rhea almost smiled at that. Elias felt something ease in his chest. She took another sip of coffee. "Must be busy this time of year." Elias shook his head. "Not really. Most people spend Christmas with family. I'm not most people." Rhea really looked at him then, and he saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Yeah, me neither." The waitress came by and refilled their cups. Elias thanked her, and she smiled before walking away. He looked down at his coffee. "I have a daughter, Lila. She's 10. She's in the Bahamas right now with her mom and stepdad." Rhea didn't say anything right away, and Elias wondered if he'd said too much. But then she said, "At least you have someone to miss. I don't even have that." Her voice was flat when she said it. like she was stating a fact rather than admitting something painful. Elias wanted to ask her about it, but pushing too hard felt wrong. Instead, he said, "Rough night?" Rhea shrugged. Part of the job. Domestic violence call, car accident on the interstate, and a kid, maybe 5 years old, left at a gas station by his parents. They just drove off and left him there. Elias felt his chest tighten. "They found him?" Rhea nodded. "Yeah, we found him. He was sitting on the curb crying, holding a stuffed dinosaur. Kept asking when his mom was coming back." Elias didn't know what to say to that. Rhea kept talking, her voice steady but strained. "We called child services. They took him. But I keep thinking about that kid. About what kind of people just leave their child at a gas station on Christmas." Elias said, "You did what you could." Rhea looked at him, and he saw the weight of everything she carried. "Yeah, but it never feels like enough." They fell back into silence. Elias noticed the way she kept her shoulders tight, like she was ready to leave at any moment. She was guarded, and he understood that. Letting people in meant risking failure, and he'd already failed enough for one lifetime. After a while, Rhea reached for her wallet to pay for the coffee. She opened it, and a photograph slipped out, landing face up on the table. Elias glanced at it before he could stop himself. It was an old picture, faded and creased. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood next to a man in a police uniform. The man was tall with broad shoulders, his dark skin gleaming under the sun. He had his hand on the girl's shoulder, and both of them were smiling. Rhea grabbed the photo quickly, but Elias had already seen it. "Your dad?" She looked at him, and for a moment, he thought she might not answer. Then she nodded. "He died when I was 8. Car accident on duty." Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Rhea stared at the photo, and her voice grew quieter. "That picture was taken at his academy graduation. I was 5. He lifted me onto his shoulder so I could see over the crowd, and I felt like I was on top of the world." She ran her thumb over the edge of the photo. "That's why I became a cop. I thought it would make me feel closer to him. Thought maybe I could understand what he was thinking that night, why he took the risks he did. But it doesn't work like that. It just makes me feel more alone." She slipped the photo back into her wallet and closed it. Elias recognized that look. It was the look of someone trying not to feel too much. Elias pulled out his phone and opened the photo of Lila. He turned the screen toward Rhea. "This is Lila. She's 10. I barely see her anymore. After the divorce, her mom moved to Connecticut. I kept telling myself I'd visit more, call more. But work always got in the way. Now she has a new family, a stepdad who's there every day, and I'm just the guy who sends birthday cards." Rhea looked at the photo and then at him. "You feel like you failed her?" Elias nodded. "Every day." He looked at the photo again. "There was this one Christmas when she was 7. We stayed up late making cookies, and she got flour everywhere. In her hair, on her face, all over the kitchen. She was laughing so hard she could barely stand up. And I remember thinking that I'd always have moments like that with her. That there would always be time." Elias's voice caught. "But there wasn't always time. I let work take over, and before I knew it, she was growing up without me. Now when I see her, she's polite but distant, like I'm someone she used to know." Rhea's expression softened. "I feel like I failed my dad. Like nothing I do is ever enough to make up for the fact that he's not here." Elias put his phone away. "You were 8 years old. How could you have failed him? Rhea shook her head. I don't know. But it feels like I did. Like if I'd been better, smarter, stronger, maybe he wouldn't have taken that risk. Maybe he would have thought about coming home to me. I used to think that if I became a cop, if I did the job right, it would somehow make up for losing him. But it doesn't. It just reminds me every day that he's gone. Elias understood that. He'd spent years blaming himself for things he couldn't control. It's not your fault. You know that, right? Rhea looked at him. Do you believe that about yourself? Elias didn't answer because they both already knew the truth. Neither of them believed it. Rhea looked down at her hands. Tonight was bad. Christmas is supposed to be this magical time, but for a lot of people it's just another day to survive. Elias said, Sounds like you've been surviving for a long time. Rhea looked up at him. Yeah, I guess I have. My mom remarried when I was 12. Nice guy. 2 kids of his own. They're a family now. A real family. And I'm just the kid from the first marriage who shows up for holidays sometimes. She looked away. They invited me for Christmas. Sent me a text with a picture of their tree. Everyone smiling. But I couldn't go. Couldn't sit there and pretend I belonged. Elias felt something crack inside him. I know that feeling. They sat there for a while longer, and Elias felt something shift between them. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was recognition. They were both broken in the same way, both carrying the same kind of loneliness. But even as he felt that connection forming, Elias also felt the fear creeping in. He'd let people in before, and it had ended badly. What made him think he wouldn't fail again? Rhea seemed to be thinking the same thing because she suddenly looked away. I should go. Early shift tomorrow. Elias knew she was lying. He could see it in the way she said it too quickly, like she needed an excuse to leave before she said too much. He wanted to tell her to stay, but he didn't because he was scared too. So he just said, Yeah, of course. Take care, Officer Donovan. Rhea stood up and pulled cash from her wallet, leaving it on the table. But before she could walk away, Elias pulled out a pen and wrote his number on a napkin. He slid it across the table. In case you ever need someone to talk to, or just someone to sit with. Rhea looked at the napkin, then at him. For a moment, he thought she might leave it there. But then she picked it up, folded it carefully, and put it in her pocket. Thanks for the company, Elias. He nodded, and she walked toward the door. Elias watched her go, and something inside him screamed at him to stop her. But he didn't. He just sat there, alone again, staring at the empty seat across from him. The door chimed as Rhea left, and the cold air rushed in for a moment before it closed again. Elias looked down at his coffee, now cold, and realized how stupid he'd been. He'd spent years pushing people away, telling himself he was protecting them from his failures. But the truth was, he was just protecting himself. He thought about Lila, about the way she used to look at him when she was little, like he was the most important person in the world. He'd lost that because he was too busy, too scared. And now he was doing the same thing again, letting Rhea walk out that door. Elias stood up and left money on the table. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. Stepping out into the cold, snow was falling harder now. He looked around, but Rhea was already at her car parked a few spaces down, standing next to it, keys in hand, staring at the diner. She hadn't left yet. Elias took a step toward her, but before he could say anything, her phone rang. Rhea answered it. Even from a distance, Elias could hear the urgency in her voice. She said something he couldn't make out, then hung up and looked at the phone like it had just delivered bad news. She got into her car, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot. Elias stood there watching her tail lights disappear into the snow. He walked back to his own car, got in, and sat there in the cold. He felt hollow, like something had been carved out of him. He thought about going home, about spending the rest of Christmas alone. But then he thought about Rhea, about the bruises on her hands and the exhaustion in her eyes. He thought about Lila. Maybe it was too late. Maybe he'd already burned too many bridges. But sitting here in the cold, watching the snow fall, Elias realized that he was tired. Tired of running. Tired of being afraid. Tired of being alone. Elias drove aimlessly through the empty streets of Boston, watching the Christmas lights blur through the snow on his windshield. It was past midnight now, and the city felt like a ghost town. Traffic lights blinked red and green for no one, and the sidewalks were covered in untouched snow. Elias felt like he was the only person left in the world. He drove past his office building, dark and empty. He drove past the park where he used to take Lila when she was little, the swings covered in snow. He drove past all the places that reminded him of the life he used to have. His phone rang at 3 in the morning. Elias was parked near the waterfront, staring at the dark water. He looked at the screen and saw an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. The voice on the other end was Rhea's, and it sounded different, smaller, shakier. Elias, I'm sorry to call. I asked the waitress at Lou's for your number. She remembered you. I just didn't know who else to call. Elias sat up straighter. What's wrong? Where are you? I'm at the station, District 4. I had to take an emergency shift, and it was bad. Really bad. There was a hostage situation, and we got everyone out safe, but I can't stop shaking. I can't go home like this. Elias was already starting the car. I'm coming. Stay where you are. He hung up and drove faster than he should have. The streets slick with ice and snow. All he could think about was the sound of Rhea's voice. The way it had cracked when she said she didn't know who else to call. The police station was a squat brick building with bright fluorescent lights that made the falling snow look almost blue. Elias parked and walked inside. He said he was there to see Rhea Donovan, and the officer at the front desk pointed toward a hallway without looking up. Elias followed it until he found a door marked locker room and waited outside. A few minutes later, Rhea came out. She'd changed into jeans and a sweater, but she still looked like she was holding herself together by sheer willpower. Her hair was down now, damp from what must have been a quick shower, and her hands were shaking even though she tried to hide them. Her face was pale and her eyes were red-rimmed. Elias said, "Hey." Rhea looked at him, and her eyes were raw with emotion. "You came. You called?" Rhea nodded, and for a moment, she just stood there like she didn't know what to do next. She looked smaller somehow, like the uniform had been the only thing holding her up. Elias said, "Come on, let's get out of here." They walked outside and the cold air hit them. Rhea pulled her coat tighter around herself. Elias led her to his car, and she got in without asking where they were going. He didn't know either. He just drove. They ended up back at the waterfront, parked near a pier where the city lights reflected off the black water. Elias turned off the engine, and they sat there in silence. The heater filled the car with warmth, and outside, the snow kept falling. He could hear the faint sound of waves lapping against the pier. Rhea stared out the window. For a long time, she didn't say anything. Then finally she spoke. Her voice was quiet, strained. "There was a guy. He had his girlfriend and her kid trapped in an apartment on the 3rd floor. He had a gun. One of the neighbors called it in. Said they heard screaming and a gunshot. Elias listened and didn't interrupt. Rhea kept talking, her voice steady but fragile. When we got there, we could hear the kid crying. He was 6 years old. 6. The same age I was when my dad started teaching me how to ride a bike. And I kept thinking, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I make him angrier? What if that kid ends up like I did, losing a parent because of one bad night? She looked down at her hands. We spent 3 hours trying to talk him down. 3 hours. I was the one on the phone with him, trying to convince him to let them go, to put the gun down. He kept saying he had nothing left to lose, that everyone had given up on him. And I just kept talking, kept telling him that it didn't have to end like this. Rhea's voice cracked. She took a shaky breath. When he finally opened the door and walked out, when I saw that kid run to his mother, everyone was celebrating. My sergeant clapped me on the back, said I did good, but I couldn't move. I just stood there in the hallway and I couldn't stop shaking because all I could think about was how close it was. How many things could have gone wrong? Elias said, but they didn't. You did your job. Everyone's safe. Rhea turned to look at him. Her expression was raw, vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. I don't know why I called you. I barely know you. I have colleagues, people I've worked with for years, but I couldn't call them. They would have told me I did great, that I should be proud, and I can't hear that right now. I can't pretend this doesn't affect me. Elias said, maybe that's why. Sometimes it's easier to be weak in front of a stranger. Rhea shook her head. I'm not supposed to be weak. I'm supposed to protect people. I'm supposed to be strong enough to handle this. Elias said, you're human first, officer second. Being human means you're allowed to break sometimes. Rhea looked away, and he saw her fighting against the tears. I can't afford to break. If I break, then what? Who am I if I'm not strong enough to handle this? My dad never broke. He went out every night and did his job. And he never complained, never showed weakness. Elias thought about that, about all the years he'd spent trying to be strong, trying to be perfect. When Lila was little, I thought being a good dad meant never showing weakness, never admitting I was scared or didn't know what to do. I thought I had to be perfect, that if I showed any cracks, I'd lose her respect. But all that did was push her away. He looked at Rhea, and she was listening now. Really listening. I learned too late that sometimes the most important thing isn't fixing everything. It's just staying. Being there when someone needs you, even if you don't have all the answers. Lila didn't need a perfect father. She just needed one who showed up. Rhea's eyes filled with tears, and she didn't try to stop them this time. They rolled down her cheeks, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to let people in. Every time I try, I just end up feeling more alone. Elias said, neither do I, but maybe we can figure it out together. Rhea let out a shaky breath, and then she leaned her head against his shoulder. Elias didn't move. He just sat there, letting her be weak, letting himself be the person who stayed. Her hair smelled like rain and something floral. He could feel her shoulders shaking slightly as she cried. And he realized that this was what it meant to be there for someone. Not fixing their problems, not offering solutions, just being present. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something right. They stayed like that for a long time, watching the snow fall and the city wake up around them. The sky started to lighten, turning from black to deep blue to soft gray. Gradually, the darkness gave way to streaks of orange and pink that spread across the horizon, reflecting off the water in shimmering bands of color. Seagulls began to call to each other, their cries breaking the silence. Elias glanced at the clock on the dashboard and realized it was almost 6 in the morning. Christmas was over and a new day was beginning. For the first time in a long time, he was glad to be part of it. Rhea sat up and wiped her eyes. She looked embarrassed now, like she'd shown too much. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for calling." Rhea managed a small smile. It was the first real one he'd seen from her. "I'm starving. You want to get coffee?" Elias smiled back. "Yeah, I know a place." They drove back to Lou's diner, and the parking lot was slowly filling with early morning customers. Inside, the same waitress from the night before was working the morning shift. She smiled when she saw them. "Back already? You two must really love my coffee." Elias and Rhea sat in the same booth where they'd met, and the waitress brought them 2 cups without asking. Rhea wrapped her hands around hers, and the steam rose up between them. The diner was warmer now, filled with the smell of bacon and fresh coffee. Elias said, "You know what I realized last night?" "What?" "I've been alone for so long, I forgot what it feels like to be seen." Rhea looked at him, and her expression softened. "Me too." They sat there in the quiet diner, drinking coffee and watching the sun come up through the window. The Christmas lights outside were still on, but they looked different now in the growing daylight. They didn't seem harsh or mocking anymore. They just looked like lights. Nothing more, nothing less. After a while, Elias said, "Can I see you again? Not tonight, not tomorrow. Just whenever you're ready." Rhea nodded. "I'd like that." Elias felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been tight for years. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if this would work, if they could build something real out of one night and 2 cups of coffee. But for the first time in a long time, he wanted to try. He wanted to believe that it wasn't too late. They finished their coffee, and the waitress came by with the check. Elias reached for it, but Rhea grabbed it first. "My turn." Elias didn't argue. They walked out together, and the snow had stopped falling. The sky was clear and bright, the kind of winter morning that felt clean and new. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. Everything looked sharper, more defined, like the world had been washed clean overnight. Elias looked at Rhea, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. There was an understanding between them now, something that didn't require words. Rhea got into her car, and Elias got into his. But before she drove away, she rolled down her window. "Merry Christmas, Elias." He smiled. "Merry Christmas, Rhea." She drove off, and Elias sat there for a moment, watching her go. But this time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet. Something fragile and uncertain, but real. Something worth protecting. He started his car and headed home. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He didn't feel alone. He just felt like himself. And that was enough.